A hymn before battle. How many worlds does this make? The dialogue took place before a wall-sized view screen. The image was not one to make for happy conversation. The 8 knew the question was rhetorical. As the djinn aged, he was becoming soft, without direction, yet powerful still. 72. Not including Barwan or dice. They have not yet fallen. The answer was silence. Then, we will use the humans. At last. Yes, your djinn. Silence. A glance at the view screen. That makes you happy, does it not, Tyr? I believe it to be a wise decision, as all your decisions are wise, your djinn. But slow to come, late, without decisiveness, without, what is that human word? Elan. The words of the 8's reply were carefully chosen. Had the decision been reached sooner, there, perhaps, would have been a greater profit. Certainly the loss would have been reduced. A long minute later, the answer. The profit will be greater in the short run, surely. But at what loss in the long tier? Surely the programs have taken effect. The humans are controllable. Those sought the Rintar group. Those humans were half-formed, brutish. They were unrefined and wild. The new races are much more malleable and well adjusted to technological controls. They are minimally dangerous, and after the invasion, the few that remain will be grateful for any bone we toss them. Another long silence as the djinn stared at the view screen. Perhaps you are right, dear, but I doubt it. Do you know why I'm allowing the human project to go forward? If you think the premise flawed, I wonder, yes. Why? Guess. A longer pause. Because we will lose many more worlds without their aid? In small part, Tyr. We will lose all the worlds without the humans. Here, djinn, our projections indicate that the Posling will fail if slow to the current rate. They will senesce. However, we stand to lose 200 more worlds before that happens. Surely an unacceptable loss. Those projections are flawed, as our projections of the humans are flawed. At the end of this era, the humans will be the masters, and that our hell will be an outcast race, living on the edge of civilization, scavenging the garbage. And your human project will be the cause. Tyr carefully schools his features. I question that projection, your djinn. It isn't a projection, you young fool. It's a statement. On the view screen, a world burned. Chapter 3. Fort McPherson, Georgia, Sol 3, 0931 EDT, March 18th, 2001 AD. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Admiral Daniel Cleburne, and for those of you who don't recognize me, I'm the Chief of Naval Operations. The secure auditorium was about half filled with a mixture of uniformed and civilian personnel, mostly male. Something about most of the civilians made Mike suspect they had once worn blue or green. Apparently others, besides General Horner, had dipped into their former commands. As covered in your agreements, each of you should have already contacted next of kin and informed them that you agreed to be locked in for a period of 2 to 4 months. You are working with a former colleague on a secret project, and you will be home soon. Please, in your future communications, downplay the severity of the situation as much as possible. That a project has shanghaied a number of civilians will, inevitably, come to the ears of the press. But the longer we can stonewall the core information, the better for the nation and the world. We prefer to release it in time with other countries in such a way to minimize uncontrolled reactions. My wife hates the old good news, bad news routine, but here goes. The good news, for most of you science fiction buffs anyway, is that first contact has been made with a friendly alien species. He waited for the muted reaction to die down. Most of the people had been playing the "What's this all about" game, and had reached at least that side of the answer. A few had guessed the rest. Now time for the other shoe. Bad news, they are in the midst of a multi-planet war. This time, the buzz of conversation went on for some time before he raised his hands. Please, we have a lot of ground to cover and not much time, so I'm going to make this fast and dirty. I want everyone to have a general feel for our goals and constraints. You will all be issued briefing papers. He gestured to a number of officers, moving down the aisles and passing out files. And there will be alien advisors. A stir started. And technologies. And grew. To draw on. At ease. We don't have time for this, people. He referred to the papers before him. First, a little background. For the last 100,000 years or so, there has been a political entity. For purposes of translation, we are referring to it as a federation, occupying the habitable planets surrounding Earth. They are all peaceful races, apparently because all the warlike races had wiped themselves out before they discovered deep space flight. For those of you sci-fiers, he grimaced, who have been pondering over the Drake equation, whatever that is, they are the reasons we haven't been getting any mail, until now at least. About 150 to 175 years ago, the periphery of the Federation experienced an invasion by a new race called the Posleen. This species is about as vile as anything you sci-fi guys ever came up with. Basic information on them is included in the briefing papers, and more detailed information will be on the planning team net. In general, they are four-legged sort of centaur-looking omnivores that lay eggs. Their technology is about as equivalent to the Federation's, and generally similar in scope, but they don't seem to use it very effectively. However, being non-violent, none of the Federation races have any history of conflict. In addition, they have some difficulties with engaging in or even discussing violence, even after having been in a war for nearly 2 centuries. They have only 2 races that are able to pull the trigger, so to speak, and those races have some problems with it. Because of their problems, they have been unable to slow the advance of the enemy. They've tried to create artificial intelligence devices, self-willed robots, to handle the problem, but after one disastrous experience, when the robots tried to take over, they outlawed the approach. With the exception of the rustle of paper, the large room was now totally silent as hard-faced men and women started flipping through the explosive documents in their hands. Mike smiled grimly at the layout. The document was subdivided into categories: introduction, threat, friendly forces, mission, and appendix. It was the most succinct document of its kind he had ever seen. The main friendly race involved in actual conflict, the Himit, are cowards. That's not an insult, it's just the way they are as a species. If they think they've been detected, even suspected, they break contact. The other race, the one we have had the most contact with, the Darhel, are only able to fire once as an individual. Then they are turned into some sort of automaton, by the very action of taking a life. The other 2 races, the Indawi and the Tikpith, are so totally non-violent they have no capacity at all for violence. Mike flipped past the threat portion and looked over the information on the first alien races ever encountered. Whatever happened over the next few months, this conference was going to be interesting. So now, basically, the Galactics let AIs do the driving. Push a button, automatically lose the button pusher, and hope for the best. The best has not happened. They have lost over 70 worlds and the rate of loss is growing. They have had some, really very little, success in space, but are totally lost in ground warfare. There has apparently been a faction that has wanted to enlist the aid of humans for practically the whole war. The plan of this faction was to get the help of humans not only as fighters, but as weapons and tactics designers. Because of their lack of experience at war, the Federation has been copying the enemy when it comes to those areas. But the enemy is not exactly the most efficient group at either one. They, the Posling that is, have one thinking leader to control around 400 troops that are not much more intelligent than chimpanzees. Their weapons do not have sights, so they depend on mass fire, somewhat like a Napoleonic War broadside, and their ships are laughable from a real war perspective. Since that is all the Federation had to work with for ideas, they used a tank that fires a sort of broad area energy mine for ground combat. Their warships are converted freighters. He snorted in disgust and looked over towards the mass of black uniforms. I think we can come up with better, and so do the world's leaders. You damn well better, or I'll have your commissions. There was some grim laughter, but most of the attendees were listening with half an ear and flipping rapidly through their briefing papers. The idea of this conference, therefore, is for each team to determine the sort of weapons and tactics that they envision their country using for this war. Now for more bad news. The upper level commanders, that is myself and some of the type commanders, are going to have to hash out a few things. But there are some political and budgetary constraints that the Federation has on its military. Those constraints are going to cause most of the Navy, Air Force, Marines, and elite Army to be absorbed by the Federation forces. At that, a buzz of conversation filled the previously silent room. Cleburne motioned for them to quiet down and kept talking. In some cases, we will interact with other countries' militaries that are going through the same thing, especially allied militaries. And the final plans for spaceships, combat shuttles, and space fighters, things related to the Federation fleet, will have to be agreed upon through a joint committee. On the other hand, because America is such a predominant power in those areas, we will have primary position on the committee. Let me be clear about the bottom line here. The people who are coming up with the concepts for warships and infantry forces had better get it right. There won't be a hell of a lot of review, and are likely to be what we're fighting for our lives with, because that is the last bad news. The reason the Federation avoided contact before this is obvious. They might be trading one devil for another, but, again obviously, this faction has gotten permission to enlist us. The reason is, they're losing, badly, and they finally had to fish or cut bait. We're the next planet in line. According to the Galactics, 4 or 5 large invasion waves are headed for Earth. The first one will be here in only 5 years. Gust front. Well, dear, you think your plans for the humans are working? The Darhel Jin waved a stick of incense through the air and placed the message to the lords on the altar of communication. The background of melodiously shining song crystals and the mirrored silver colonnades aided his contemplation of the multitude of alternate futures. At the moment, he sorely needed the aid. Most of the futures looked bleak. His Ndawi body attendants lifted his robes as he rose and turned to the attendant tier. The younger Darhel's fox-like face was the well-trained mien of a senior Darhel manager. He returned the Jin's earflick of polite query with total impassivity. In fact, better than 2/3 of the overall plan was in total disarray, mostly because of the actions of a single lucky individual. Admitting that, however, was not a route to power, and there was little for this old fossil to pick apart. The entirety of the plan was known only to himself. "No plan unfolds in perfection," the tear said smoothly. "That is the purpose of management." The elfin djinn flicked his ears again. The gesture was deliberately ambiguous. It might have been agreement, or it might have been polite disbelief. The difference was subtle. "We retain dice." The djinn deliberately did not ascribe that as a positive or a negative trait. Destroying the allied human forces arrayed to defend the planet might or might not have been part of the young pup's plan. Leaving the statement ambiguous was a deliberate trap with overtones he doubted the tear was aware of. The tear flared his nostrils in agreement and glanced at the gathered Ndawi. "It is an important world." The corporations of DICE were entirely Darhel controlled, despite the billions of Ndawi residents. The laborers of the Federation were as disposable as bacteria. The revenue is significant. The djinn's nostrils flared. As expected, the young fool had sidestepped. And Barwan as well. "Regrettably, the human loss there has been great." The expression he displayed now was one copied from humans. Cat-pupiled, vertically slitted eyes, opening wide. The white mobile mouth turned down, exposing the edge of shark-like teeth. Even the ears drooped. It was a subtle and effective expression, and one difficult to copy. Humans would have slumped in apparent defeat as well. Sorrow was not a Darhel emotion. Hatred, yes. Anger, definitely. Sorrow, no. The djinn took a moment to contemplate his own plans. The djinn knew that the road to mastery was not one of plots alone. A clear understanding of reality was paramount. That the young fool had risen to his current place was a sign that the quality of the opposition had fallen off, or of a deeply laid plan. The djinn gave an internal flare to the nostrils. No deep plans here. His own plans had every path to the future open to his own designs, and every path shut to the young fool. There was no flaws in his approach. It was a warm feeling. "Your plan will require further adjustment. You are frustrated on DICE by the actions of a single human." "Yes, your djinn," agreed the tear. He had set the trap, and the old fool had wandered right in. "I fear my presence on Earth will be required for the next phase." "And that is?" The djinn set the Targan trap and waited for the query. The tear's face settled into even less readable lines. The next phase was obvious, even to this old fool. The humans must enter the path to enlightenment. Individuality is an obstacle to oneness that must be overcome. "And you propose to do that how?" The djinn flicked his ears again in that deliberately ambiguous manner. "There are so many paths to success, it would take days to describe. Suffice it to say that the humans must be pawns to the path of enlightenment. Their myth of individuality shall be crushed, and with it their passion. The way of passion is not the way to success in our current endeavors, nor is it the way to enlightenment." The tear paused, trembling slightly. "The time of heroes is past, and the time of certain individuals in particular is long last." The tear was a master of facial control, but his control of body language was still spotty. The deep breath and rippling of muscles along the upper limbs spoke of surging anger. The young fool was on the edge of Lentate. The Jinn schooled his face into mobility. The deer had been reading his reports and analyses too long. He had forgotten that, hidden deep beneath the veneer of civilization, the heart of the Darhel was the heart of a frustrated warrior. This was the very urge that he now fought, and that heart told the Jinn that his opponent had seriously miscalculated. Humans would not be so easily vanquished as a threat to Darhel control. I am joyful that our people have such exquisite leadership, the Jinn said. Then he also copied a human expression, as his lips drew back in a broad smile. The glittering teeth of a rending carnivore were exposed for all to see, and the watching Indawi shut their eyes and turned away. None of them had the stupidity to actually run or otherwise embarrass the Darhel lords, but none of them would ever forget the sight. Our future is in good hands. Chapter 5. Rabun County, Georgia, United States of America, Sol 3, 1723 Eastern Standard Time, February 3rd, 2004. As the car dropped over the ridge into the Pocket Valley in the Georgia hills, Sharon O'Neill almost turned around. She had never understood her reaction to Mike's father. A gruff but fair man, he occasionally called her lieutenant, and treated her like a chief with a junior officer. Courteous, if occasionally salty. At her request, he refrained from relating war stories to the children, and rarely did so around her. But she had heard enough over the years to understand him somewhat. Perhaps it related to her Navy experience, where she felt so exceedingly rejected by the old boy establishment. Mike Sr. would drop without a ripple into a group of Navy chiefs, without much of a ripple into a group of Navy officers, especially a group of surface warfare types. He would be indistinguishable from a group of SEALs. Whether it was real or not, she always felt a trace of contempt, or perhaps superiority emanating from the old warhorse. After a long career related to the unfortunate brevity of human life, and the means to arrange for reducing it, Mike O'Neill Sr. returned to the family farm to raise crops like generations before him, and to raise his family. Since then, with the exception of collecting weapons, some of them illegal, and a group of retirees with a similar bent, he appeared to have put that earlier phase of his life behind him. She knew he had left the army under somewhat mysterious circumstances. The failure to be recalled along with all his buddies was confirmation of that he had spent some time overseas doing things of a military nature. But what really bothered her was the old boy feeling. Now he seemed tailor-made for her needs, and she was going to have a hard time looking him in the eyes and saying that. She glanced at Callie beside her. If she had to choose which of her children might survive on a world consumed by war, she would have chosen Callie. Usually the older child is more reserved and prissy, but with her children it was reversed. If Michelle scratched her finger, she broke into paroxysms of tears. If Callie ran into a wall, she stood up, wiped the blood off her nose, and kept running. But she was still only 7, would only be 9 when the Posleen landed, and her mommy and daddy were both going to be far, far away. Michelle was already gone, consumed by a colony ship packed with dependents, headed for safety. That program had come under fire both in the United States and overseas. Called racist, supremacist, and every other ist anyone could come up with, it still made too much sense to stop. If a human gene pool was going to be moved off planet, and given the situation, it made sense to create such a backup. It made sense to choose from the gene pool that represented the necessary skills. Right now, the Federation did not need scientists, and it did not need politicians, and it did not need engineers. What it needed was soldiers. It might not be nice, it might not be politically correct, But it made sense, and that was all the Federation cared about. The house was stone, unusual in this part of the mountains, and dated to well before the Civil War. The O'Neills were among the first settlers in the area after the Cherokee were forcibly relocated, and the house was designed to protect against the understandably angry stragglers. The first O'Neill was an Irish immigrant who mined gold for a few years, then decided that there was more money to be made selling food to the miners than mining. He marked out a stake, broke the ground, and built the farmhouse with the occasional help of his fellow miners. It presided regally over a small valley so filled with good things that it seemed that God had touched it. On the south-facing slope was an orchard of apples, and below that an orchard of pecans. The fields were broken into tillage and pasture with hay in portions. It was a tidy and productive 600 acres that satisfied the financial and nutritional needs of the O'Neill family, even in these hard times. The government was gathering all the foodstuffs it could and caching them in hardened shelters throughout the Rockies and Appalachians. The survivors of America might be on the run, but the United States government was determined that they be well-fed runners. Unfortunately, even with new ground being broken, genetically modified crops, and the modern American agricultural engine getting into high gear for the first time, that meant shortages. Shortages were something that happened to other people, not Americans. When Americans walk into a grocery store, they expect cheerful smiling bag boys and fresh produce. Now, the bag boys were all in uniform, and the produce fields were producing wheat and corn crops that were going into holes in the mountains. America's wheat yield the previous year had been 25% higher than at any time in history, but there was a bread shortage. Even small farmers such as Papa O'Neill were required to report their production and adhere to crop quotas, but the government did not expect or desire to control every acre. The O'Neill garden had kept the family in fresh vegetables throughout the long summer, as Sharon awaited her summons to uniform, and Mike sat through endless speeches and parades. The simple numbers meant that one of them would not be coming back, probably Mike, and that Callie's chances were less than good. As a mechanical engineer specializing in maintenance support requirements, Sharon fully expected a glorified clerk's position on Titan Base. Her chances were better than fair. Unfortunately, she could take neither her husband nor her eldest daughter with her. As they pulled up in the twilight, the simian shape of her father-in-law, the man from whom Mike had derived his innate strength, if not height, stood silhouetted in the doorway. They were sitting in the living room of the farmhouse. It had a bachelor pad look to it, the feeling that there were no women residing in the house. For all that, it was neat as a pin. An oakwood fire blazed on the hearth against the winter chill, while Sharon nursed a glass of white wine that was growing quite warm. She wondered if she dared ask for ice, while Mike Sr. nursed a beer gone much the same way. Both of them had been sitting that way since getting Callie off the bed, more unspoken between them than might ever be possible to say. I have to ask. It doesn't have a thing to do with this, with Callie, but it's important to me. She paused, wondering how to go on, wondering if she should. Did she really want to know the answer? Why do you leave the army? Shit, he said, getting up and going to his sideboard. He threw away the warm beer, pulled out an ice bucket, walked over and plunked 2 cubes in her glass, then walked back over and pulled out a mason jar. He poured 2 fingers in a small glass mug, knocked it back with a "pa" and a grimace, then poured 2 more and walked back over to his chair carrying the jar. The chair, with its cowhide cover, complete with coarse hairs, had the look of much of the house, rough, dependable, marginally comfortable, but not by any means aesthetic. He flumped into it with a sigh and continued. I knew you were working up to that.
How? She asked, swirling the wine and ice with her forefinger. She took a sip as it slowly cooled.
You never asked, and I could tell that you never asked Mike.
I did, but he told me to ask you.
When?
He asked, pouring another hit of the fiery moonshine. Shortly after I first met you, I asked him what was with you, while you were a Zoe.
Loony?
No, just, well...
Eccentric, then, he prompted with a shrug.
Okay, eccentric. And he told me you had an interesting career, and you've talked about other stuff, but never that, and hardly at all about Vietnam.
She cocked her head to one side. You were born in what, 72?
3, she corrected.
Let's see,
he said, scratching his chin. The action reminded her so strongly of Mike Jr. for a moment that she caught her breath.
In 1973, he continued, I was at Bragg, but I went back in 74.
I thought we pulled out of Vietnam in 72 and 3, she said, puzzled.
Oh, we did, sure, he said slyly. All except the Studies and Observation Group.
The what?
The SOG. What was the SOG? He asked rhetorically. Well, first of all, we were guys that you absolutely could not introduce to your mother, or to Congress, which amounts to the same damn thing. We were a bunch of major badass hard cases for which the war could just not be over. It could not be a loss, therefore they created a way for us to go back into the jungle. SEALs, LERPs, Rangers, Phoenix, SF, Marine Recon, they all contributed. Its purpose was basically payback. The brass knew the war was lost. Hell, officially and effectively we had pulled out, but there were some targets that we just felt should not survive the experience. A few situations that needed cleansing in a big way. He took a pull from the 200-proof liquor and stared at the crackling fire, mind far away in time and space. I didn't really understand the fucking Vietnamese then. I mean, the fucking VC were such absolute stone-cold motherfuckers. They would do things to people I still wake up in a cold sweat over. But some of them, hell, maybe most of them, did it because they were patriots. Maybe some of them got their rocks off, but quite a few of them were sickened by it as I was. They did it because the mission was to unite Vietnam under communism. And they believed in that was the same hardcore light that I believed that was evil incarnate. It took me damn near 15 years to come to that conclusion. He shook his head over old wounds, bone deep. Anyway, we were there to arrange permanent solutions for some of the more unpleasant examples of dialectical materialism as manifest on Earth. There were 2 targets that stand out in my mind. It was one of those situations when there was a fine dividing line. There are a lot of situations that are black and white, but most are shades of gray. This was a situation where 2 people disagreed on what shade one of the targets was. They were both consummate motherfuckers. No disagreement there. But one motherfucker was officially on our side, and the other motherfucker was officially on the other side. Well, I finally decided that I was tired of distinctions like that, so I killed them both. She looked at the glass clutched in his hand. Thick crystal formed into a handleless mug. On it was a legend so chipped and marred as to be illegible, but from a faint outline of a shield and an arrow, she knew that the inscription would be De oppresso liber, to liberate the oppressed. It was such a high-minded motto, dropped in the devil's cauldron of Southeast Asia,
where the oppressed seemed to seek oppression over freedom, where enemies were friends and friends were enemies. For the lesser soldiers, it was the moment-to-moment fear of the booby trap, the mine and the sniper. For those who ruled the jungle, it was the fear of betrayal, the knife in the back. Across more than 30 years, the jungle of the mine seemed to reach out and touch the tough old man across from her. Anyway, it really pissed off the brass. However, giving the real reason it pissed them off wouldn't work. But everybody was into something back then. Some of them were smuggling drugs back to the world. Some of them were moving comfort rations out to the front. Whatever. Me, I've been moving some equipment back to the world for the last few tours. The kind of equipment guaranteed to not make the ATF very damn happy. Anyway, they put that together with a couple of other things and womped up a court-martial for smuggling and black market. 20 years in Leavenworth was the verdict. I got chipped off about when Mike was born. After 3 years, a particular appeal worked and I was out. He snorted faintly at some remembrance, and Sharon realized that the hits of white lightning were finally starting to have some effect. Now, I could have, probably should have, come home. But I never was into the story of the prodigal son. If I found myself shoveling pig shit, I wasn't going home until I was the chief pig shit shoveler. A buddy clued me that there were positions available for someone with my skills. Positions where I'd probably meet a few old friends. The feds wouldn't care for it, but hell, they don't like anything they don't directly control, while being spot on any evil they do. So I went back to being a soldier, on my own side. He shook his head again at the futility of the long war between East and West. It was fought on battlefields throughout the world, most undeclared, and it killed more than bodies. But you know, me and my buddies, we sure could win the goddamn battles, but we could never win the goddamn wars. It was Vietnam all over again. In Rhodesia, my unit, the RSAS, we had some team rack up the highest kill ratio in history. 5 guys wiped out a guerrilla regiment. Poof, gone. And we still lost the goddamn war. It was then, after Rhodesia, that I just got fed up. I was making a living, but I sure as hell wasn't making a difference. The gooks won every fucking time. So I came home and became a farmer like my father, and his father, and his father. And someday, God willing, Mike will come through that door again and only leave horizontal. He turned blazing eyes on his daughter-in-law, and she realized that he was finally talking to her as a fellow soldier, not just a civilian in uniform. You know, Sharon, and this may be the last time I get a chance to teach a young officer, it really is true that you have to pay more attention to your friends than your enemies. You can defend against the enemy, but it is damn hard to defend yourself against your own side. He shook his leonine head again and poured some moonshine. The fire of his soul suddenly damped. Papa O'Neill, she said after some thought. Hey, LT. He did not look up from swirling his moonshine. I'm glad you shot him. If you hadn't, you wouldn't be here for us. She smiled faintly. God works in mysterious ways. He commented. Well, in any case, I didn't shoot him. I used a knife. I wanted to see his eyes. He shook his head again and threw the fresh white lightning onto the fire, where it blazed like a beacon in the night.